Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. My name is Neil Perkin. I'm the moderator and curator of Google Firestarters. And so Firestarters was a series of live events we did at Google for many years, which we've now pivoted into a series of video chats with the interested and interesting of the industry. And today's guest is no exception to that. So I'm delighted to have on Firestarters Patricia McDonald, who is the Global Head of Strategy at Dentsu Creative. So really delighted to have you on the podcast, Pat. So would you care to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Pat. So as Neil said, I've got the great privilege of working across all of Dentsu's creative businesses. So from the more brand-led agencies to the more experience innovation-led, which plays really well to my background. So I started out as a brand strategist back in the day at BBH, then got very involved in BBH Labs, our innovation accelerator, spent some time at the AND partnership, setting up their social media proposition. Moved to Isobar, where I did lots of digital services, platforms, products for clients, and then spent a couple of years at Shandwick, dipping my toe into the world of PR and earned media before circling back to Dentsu.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pat, for taking the time to speak to us on Firestarters today. So, as you know, Firestarters is organised around 5 key questions, and so across that career, across lots of different types of agencies, there, just really love to get into our first question, which is really about the best thing that you've learned in your career to date. So, if I could ask you that question, Pat, to kick us off.
Yeah, so the thing that I quote most often to young strategists that I'm working with is actually something that I learned from Jim. So luckily he didn't say it when you interviewed him. But something he used to tell me a lot is it's not enough to be right. You've got to take people with you. And it's really, I think, invaluable advice for younger strategists. You can be the brainiest person in the room, and you can have the most perfect, impenetrable, logical argument. But if you're not taking people with you on the journey and they're not buying it and you're not checking in with them, it doesn't matter. And I think that the kind of backup to that, I would say, is that one of the things I've learned over the years is that when you're trying to take people with you, storytelling really is your superpower. So if you can listen really kind of attentively to what a group of people are saying, and then thread what they're saying together into a story that's very simple, very compelling, makes sense to everyone in the room, you're well on the way to taking people with you. So I'm a huge believer in the power of storytelling as a real superpower, because you know that there are people that I work with every day who are much better at data than I am, and way better at technology, and much better at performance, and all those things. But I think what my superpower is in the family is kind of listening to this incredible brainy stuff and then taking that back and making it simple and clear and compelling for other people who are not those kind of absolute brilliant subject matter specialists. So storytelling, I think, take people with you on the journey. I think one thing I learned at Weber is kind of allied to that storytelling point is all about managing the narrative. So something that I think a real difference between advertising folk and PR folk. If you ask someone in advertising, how's it going? We'll typically go, oh, well, you know, it's a bit of a disaster, you know, that client's annoyed and that script's just not working, and I don't know, really worried. You know, certainly if you kind of grew up with Nigel Bogle, that's the kind of tenor of an advertising agency. And if you ask someone in PR how it's going, generally they'll go, it's great, absolutely brilliant, you know, nailed this, smashing it on that front. And it kind of made me realize that you've got to control the narrative of your own career and how things are going as well. You've got to be not kind of in any way misleading, but you've got to be managing that narrative of actually it is going really well. This happened that was really positive, and I did that last week, and this is looking really promising. Because people generally don't notice what other people are doing. You have got to kind of call that out a little bit, and I think that's quite uncomfortable for strategists, because we're generally quite sort of shy, and we sort of hope that if we sit in the corner and do really good work, someone will kind of come along and reward us for that. And that doesn't always happen. So mine are really all about stories and consensus building, and the consensus building power of a story. And then I think the last one is something John Bartle always used to say, that the best strategists are generous at heart. And I think that's a big one for me. You know, I sometimes say generosity is a kind of operating system in its own right. If you give things out into the world, whether that's a piece of advice, a coffee, a great kind of fact, a nice insight, then it does all come back to you. It really is a superpower. And I think that is something that is, again, very specific to planners and strategists. We have to be generous. We put stuff out there and someone else picks it up and runs with it and, gets, generally speaking, a lot more glory. And you've got to be comfortable with that. So I think it's a great kind of operating system for a planner.
There's a couple of really interesting things in there, Pat, and I think actually you mentioned these briefly in a brilliant post that you wrote last year, which was a letter to your younger self. And I have to say that was, I think, one of my posts of the year. Actually, it was just a really well articulated kind of list of good sort of life lessons. But I think that sort of, if we can go back to that storytelling piece, I think you mentioned there about if you can tell us a good story, you don't need to be the loudest voice to be the most powerful or the most memorable. So what did you mean by that? So what's this kind of interesting dynamic here between being able to tell a story and being the loud voice and the most memorable voice? And what's that about?
I think a lot of planners are naturally a bit more introverted. Replacing kind of noise with signal and not having to dominate a conversation, but being able to take a little step back sometimes and say, it seems to me that what we're all saying is this, in a pithy, clean, sort of memorable story, then people are like, that's right, that's it. And it's usually something people can repeat and pass on. And that becomes very powerful. And of course, you've not got to not really care that people remember who said it. You've just got to care that they remember it and they
Right.
pass it on. There's a lovely Neil Gaiman quote where he talks about the kind of he talks about stories that have an evolutionary advantage, and he talks about the glass slipper in Cinderella and says that story has persisted over centuries because there's something odd about it. And because there's something odd in it, it's a glass slipper, which is totally impractical, utterly useless thing to make a slipper from. It's got an evolutionary advantage, and it spreads and it shares and it grows and it takes on a life of its own. And that's the power of a good story. People adopt it and take it and run with it.
That's really nice. And I think one of the other things which you wrote, I think, was around how sometimes you can be too nice, but you can't be too kind, which I think relates to the point you were making there. And I think you were describing there about how sometimes it's possible to be too accommodating or you're agreeable in your behaviors, and that can be quite self-destructive. So what's the sort of tipping point when that can become actually a negative thing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there's a kind of curve. I think in bell curves a lot. It's kind of a planner's curse, but I think at a certain point you're being nice and you're just creating a kind of sense of security for the team. And there's that kind of nice sense that high performing teams are teams that have got a sense of psychological security. So being nice and kind and asking people how their day is, it's all good. And I think where it becomes destructive is when there's something I call the good girl trap. I talk about it quite a lot. And it kind of really crystallized in my head when I went along to schools. I was looking at schools for my daughter. And it's a very distinguished headmistress, and she was talking about the benefits of single sex education. She said the thing is, when you've got mixed schools, and there's nothing wrong with mixed schools because my daughter's in one, but she said girls start to raise their hand less very, very early on. By the time they're 5 or 6, they're not putting their hand up because they're worried they're going to get it wrong. And they're very conscientious and they're very careful about the presentation of their work, and they don't like to mess up. And I really thought, oh my goodness, I see so many women in the workplace doing exactly that because they're very, very good students. They wouldn't have made it this far if they weren't good students. And they're diligent and they're conscientious. And that's really valuable. There's a point where it tips into being quite destructive. So, at the start of your career, you can be really challenging because you don't know anything. So you're kind of challenging and you're provocative and you're like, why do we do it that way? And then you sort of learn that there are rules and there's kind of best practice and you probably should follow some of those rules. And if you become really impactful in an organization, you come out the other end and say, I know the rules, I understand them, I totally hear you about best practice, but I think there's a better way. And I think lots of women get stuck in the middle of that. And that's what I call the good girl trap. It's the kind of, I'm going to just keep quietly working away till 3 a.m. with this kind of impossible task because I'm very, very conscientious. And if I say I think the system's broken and we shouldn't do it like that, I've sort of stepped out of my boundaries. I'm not being kind of good and diligent, and I'm not following the rules anymore. And it's such an opportunity cost to businesses if kind of people get trapped there, that I think it's a real shame. And there's also there's a really interesting bit of analysis on how women describe themselves in their appraisals versus how men do. So it's and this is self-appraisals. This is how people have learned to talk about themselves. And women tend to say that they're hardworking and they're diligent and they've got great attention to detail and they're a bit of a perfectionist. And men tend to kind of say, I'm a rock star, absolutely smashing it on that front, incredible on this. And it's just we start to kind of absorb those stories about acceptable kind of versions of female performance very early.
It's so interesting you talk about that. I think that what you were saying there, as you were talking, I was thinking about that opportunity cost actually for maybe the business itself actually not getting that kind of input. And so what is it that the businesses and teams can do to actually create the right kind of environment to avoid that kind of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got to create a climate where people aren't afraid to raise their hand, and also a climate where you recognize if that's happening, and you seek people out, and you read body language well, and you say, it kind of felt to me like you weren't totally on board with that. Is that right? Let's talk about that a little bit more. So you can't assume that everyone has felt equally comfortable in a room expressing themselves. And there's lots of different reasons why people might not feel equally comfortable expressing themselves. And in a time when you're getting lots and lots of input, it's easy to assume, well, no one said they weren't happy, so they must be fine. But I think you've got to seek those answers out a little bit.
I guess it's interesting what you're saying there about your second point, actually, relative to that, which is about generosity, when you were saying that earlier, and generosity is a kind of an operating system. And there's a great Paul Arden quote, actually, which is one of my all-time favorites, where he talks about giving away all you know and more will come back to you. And I guess sometimes that can be quite counterintuitive, can't it? The idea of actually giving away all your ideas and your thinking and so on. So do you think that is quite difficult to do sometimes?
I think it's a wonderful quote. I'd not heard that before, and I totally agree. I think there's a tendency sometimes, if you feel uncomfortable, to kind of hoard knowledge in an organization. You can sort of feel like, well, knowledge is power, so I'm going to sort of accumulate these things and I'm not going to share. And my instinct is always, as soon as I know something, I go and tell someone else about it. Or as soon as I find something that I think is valuable to someone else, I'll connect them with it, because there's no point in me having a wonderful kind of filing cabinet of knowledge and insight if it's not being used and circulated around the business. And actually, I think the real power is being a connector and being someone who pulls people together and says, well, you really must meet that person and you really ought to read this thing, because I think that's when you start to build a really positive network of allies. And it's when the business starts to do more interesting things, because you're building connections between people and skill sets they wouldn't normally have had.
I'm going to take this into the second question now, if I may, because talking there about some really important learnings that you've had in your career. But what do you think was the biggest mistake that you've made in your career, and what did you learn from that?
Oh, there's so many. I think a mistake I used to make a lot when I was younger is it's kind of linked to the conversation we were having. I used to think that I really had to crack everything on my own. I used to think that my job was to go off into a room on my own and get to a brilliant answer and then bring it back and present it to people sort of on a platter and say, there you go, that isn't it beautiful? And I think I remember I was actually working with Mel Exxon on a pitch, and she was just like, no, let me in. This is not how I want to work. And it was like, oh, okay, but I thought that was my job. I thought you wanted me to go away and come back and tell you the answer, because that's what us brainy folk do. And of course, Mel, being an incredible brain, was just like, absolutely not. I want to be part of the answer. And that's a kind of wonderful sort of light bulb moment of going, oh, okay. So I don't need to be closing things down. I can be opening things up, and we can be making this better together. It sounds obvious, but it is an easy mistake to make. And I think it's a mistake that it is easy to kind of default back to when you're under pressure. I think I can always tell how pressurized I'm feeling by how open I am to input from elsewhere. So if I'm relaxed and happy and thriving, it's like, oh, that's a really good idea. We should, yeah, oh yeah, why not? That's okay. Let's take it off there. Let's explore that for a bit. If I'm feeling under huge pressure, I can still default to that behavior of going, no, this is the answer. Focus, because we're going over here, and we haven't got time for kind of distractions. So that's a mistake. I think related to the whole sort of good girl trap, I think I've definitely made that mistake in my career. I think when I started out, I'd occasionally get criticism, and people would say, well, you're quite you're quite opinionated and a bit dismissive about that, and didn't really listen enough to that person. And I really took it on board very personally, and kind of absorbed all of that. And kind of a few years later, I was getting reviews and appraisals saying, yeah, you're just a bit too nice, you're a bit too accommodating, you could be a bit more direct. And it was like, oh my goodness, you can't win. And it's a balance and a tightrope that I walk to this day, I think. And that's all right. I think it's just being aware of it, that it is a balance, and being aware that it's not becoming that opportunity cost to the business. Because I think it can sometimes feel like we're being incredibly helpful by trying to solve everything ourselves. And actually, if I'm trying to solve a problem that I'm not best placed to solve, but I'm just trying to give someone a hand, then it's kind of a waste, because I'm not solving the things that I am best placed to solve.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think quite hard sometimes to actually create that sort of idea of creating solutions is a team sport type of idea. I mean, you've run strategy teams, of course, a number of them. So, I mean, how did you kind of create that kind of culture and way of working in the teams that you've run?
I think something that we used to say a lot at BBH was, none of us is as good as all of us. And I think that's really important. I think I've always liked having very diverse teams from all sorts of different backgrounds. So, some folks might come from a brand background, folks might come from media, digital, data, you name it. And we've all got stuff to learn from each other. And no one's brilliant at all of it, but we can all be better by listening to each other. And I always talk about strategy as being a bit of a bow tie. There's a kind of a point where you assess the landscape, and you do lots of research, and you figure out and distill down to the message. And then you've got to open right up again and think, where am I going to land this message? What are the channels? Where am I going to connect with people? What are the experiences I'm going to put in place? And I think there's a danger sometimes. A lot of strategists think their job is to get to the message, and that's half the job. I think the other half is absolutely thinking about the end-to-end experience and how that story connects with people. And sometimes I say that, and people are like, well, you want a unicorn, they don't exist. And I sort of say, it's not a unicorn, it's just a person who listens to the other person on their team, person who's curious and always wanting to learn more. So yeah, I think that's how you tackle it, with kind of curiosity, just that kind of boundless curiosity for what everyone else is doing, and giving everyone a platform, and kind of doing away with that idea that there are brand strategists or digital strategists or comm strategists. That there are just strategists, and we all need to be able to have all these tools in our armory.
Earlier on, you mentioned about psychological safety and security, which I think is a great point. And I'm just wondering here about, a great way of thinking about psychological safety is that idea of comfort with dissent combined with mutual trust and respect. And comfort with dissent is often something that people miss about being able to speak up and actually have those kind of healthy conversations. So do you think, that is really important in terms of creating this kind of idea of a team sport when you're driving solutions?
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think you've got to be comfortable enough to argue, and you've got to be comfortable enough to say, I disagree, without thinking it's going to damage the relationship. And that only comes from a place of safety. Something I like to say a lot is, tough on the work, gentle on the people. And I think you can be tough on someone's thinking, while still being very kind to them as a person, and recognizing that we are all sensitive about our thinking. But if you can't really kick the tires on an idea, you're not going to get to great work.
Let's take this back into like the industry now, and just thinking a bit about how marketing and advertising itself is really changing. And so my third question is really about your insight around that. What do you think is the fundamental ways in which it's really changing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happening is I think we're becoming more polarized and more binary as an industry. So, we have these ridiculous debates happening about brand versus performance, data versus creativity, long versus short term. And, the answer to all of those has to be both, and I think I get most concerned when I see that kind of brand versus performance language, because, we all know, thanks to Les and Peter, that, nothing works harder than brand, nothing works harder than creativity. And I guess the thing that keeps me up at night is also Les and Peter's fault. It's that chart they have about that kind of decoupling of awarded creativity and effective creativity. So for years we could say the most creatively awarded work in the world is also the most effective. And now we can't say that anymore. And that's a real worry, I think. And if we dig into why that's happening, I think it is that separation of brand and performance, or brand and experience. So we create this brilliant award-winning work that is doing really interesting, non-traditional things, lots of great innovation, but we're not necessarily always putting the big brand thinkers together with the digital folks, the innovation folks, the performance folks, so you get to brilliant work that works. Something we talk about a lot at Dentsu is the idea that when you know how to, when you know what you believe, you know how to behave, and how you behave tells people everything about who you are. And I think that is really all about creating that virtuous circle where you can tell big brand stories, but you tell them in non-traditional ways, and you design experiences that are absolutely brand building, that are distinctive and ownable and disarmingly human. So it comes back really to creating those hybrids, creating those shared teams, and that sense of being secure enough to learn from each other. Because I think if we're going to create modern creativity that really works, that isn't, a kind of hobby or a kind of project that we just happen to get live, we've got to bring all those kinds of thinkers to the table.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting what you're saying there. And we've had some interesting conversations actually in some of the other episodes about the balance between generalism and specialism.
Mm.
And, I mean, if you're thinking there about, you need depth of expertise in a lot of these channels and, areas because of the kind of specificity, I suppose, of them. But then you need to bring it together in ways that connect the dots. So do you think really the job of a strategist is really to do that, to bring together things in ways that connect those dots?
Yeah, I always like the expression that, generous open doors and specialists walk through them. And strategists are I think strategists are generalists, oftentimes with a kind of specialism or two to their bow. But I think that the job of a strategist really is to, well, one, think about what really defines this brand. What's his reason for existing in the world? And that is a very specialist skill. But then think about the end-to-end journey, and where is it falling down, but also where are the opportunities to make it delightful? So it's not just about removing friction, it's also about creating moments of real delight and real brand connection. And I think we've got to be generalist enough to look at the whole thing and be able to say, look, you asked me for this, you asked for a brand campaign, or you asked for a kind of an app, and actually that's not what you need. I know it's what you want, and I've heard your brief and I understand it. I can do one of those, but actually I think what you really need to be doing is this, and that's not my area of specialism, but there's some people in the business who are brilliant at that, so let's go and talk to them.
It's interesting because I think you were a contributor to Eat Your Greens, which is the brilliant marketing strategy book, and I think you talk a bit about this in your chapter there, don't you? But about the rational fallacy that persists in how we design online experiences. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think we've all onboarded the idea that we're fundamentally quite irrational people and we're very emotion driven and very brand driven. But then when we come to design and experience, there's a lot of it becomes very quickly about removing friction, removing all possible points of friction from the journey. And actually, you get to a place where every experience looks very much like every other experience. Every checkout looks the same, every kind of ordering app looks the same. And as people spend more and more time online and they're mostly experiencing brands in the feed and in the stream and in the app, it's really important that we start to design experiences that aren't just fit for purpose and aren't just frictionless, but are really genuinely additive to the brand. And I think the creative toolkit that we've now got really helps us do that. So we have, all kinds of interesting technologies, whether it's augmented reality or voice or gesture, image recognition, all those things. You really can design a very delightful, compelling online experience. And, it doesn't always have to be about removing friction. I think, for me, a good analogy is if I walk in the door of a store and it's a luxury high-end store, it doesn't behave in any way like me walking in the store of a fast fashion retailer. That they both kind of sell clothes, but that's where the similarity ends, and it should be that way online. And we actually asked some CMOs about this recently, and they said most of them agreed that an online store, an online experience should feel as distinctive as an offline experience. So that's I think, super interesting challenge for us as an industry.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that leads us quite nicely into the fourth question, actually, which is about the future. So, what would you say your key prediction is for the future of marketing or advertising, whichever way you want to take it? But future facing, what would be your key prediction?
So another bit of data that I saw recently was, again, we do a CMO survey every year, and 81% agreed that their business is going to make a fundamental pivot in response to climate change in the near future. And that's an absolutely mind-blowing number when you think about it. 81% saying they're going to make a fundamental pivot. And we sort of framed the question as, is that a shift from access to ownership? Is that a shift from automotive to mobility? It's shifts of that nature. And that's such an incredible opportunity for our industry, I think, to completely reframe how a business delivers its core benefit is such an exciting opportunity. And it's an opportunity that really only our industry can deliver on. So, we're going to be asking businesses to shift from offering a real world experience to a virtual experience, or shifting from something that is personal to something that is shared, or from a consumption based economy to a circular economy. And that's incredible. The experience that you'll have to design around that is important. But I think there's a couple of other things that are really key that we're going to excel at as an industry. We're going to need to create ecosystems where we bring diverse groups of clients together with policymakers, with other stakeholders, with consumers, to create the kind of infrastructure that enables real change. we're going to need to design experiences that make more sustainable behaviours, not just easy, but also rewarding and delightful. And most importantly, we're going to have to make that emotional connection with people that makes them feel, actually, yeah, that's quite aspirational. That's quite cool. I do want to wear vintage clothes, or I do actually want to be a bit more plant-based, or actually I'm going to reduce my travel. I'm going to travel more locally. And we're brilliant at making things aspirational as an industry. You think back to the kind of heyday of Levi's, we've got people wearing boxer shorts, in their millions, who never had before. That's our superpower as an industry. So I think that's going to be incredibly exciting for us. If we can be enabling businesses to make a fundamental systemic pivot in terms of their operating model, in terms of their offering for customers, then we've got an unbelievably exciting future as an industry. And it's a future that's got some purpose behind it. And, we talk about the Great Resignation a lot. We are losing young talent in droves. So if we're able to become an industry that has that sense of a kind of galvanizing purpose behind it, I think it helps us on that front as well.
There's lots to unpack in your answer there, but I think one of the key things that I was thinking about there is the role of the strategist in, I guess, designing those ecosystems. And it strikes me that the old debate about strategy coming further upstream and needing to really think about how you define the problems that you want to solve, and not necessarily being a comms answer all the time, but actually thinking about how you design business models, think about the ecosystems. Do you think that is an opportunity for strategy in the industry, or can that realistically happen?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot is we all have is virtual products and services. And I was really struck the other week. There's a Gucci handbag, a virtual Gucci handbag, and it sold for more than the real world equivalent. And on the one hand, you think that's completely mad. That's a collection of pixels that you can only ever use in Roblox. And on the other hand, you think, well, of course that makes sense, because brands are all about intangible value. They're all about our ability to take one product, one collection of materials, and imbue that with a meaning and a kind of reverence that makes people pay, tens of thousands of times more than they pay for another product that does exactly the same thing. So it shouldn't be surprising to us as an industry that people will pay real money for virtual things, because it's all about meaning. That's what they're buying. And I think that is just a phenomenal example of the power of brand and the power of strategy. And it could be something that in the future is really interesting in helping businesses reduce their footprint. So I think strategy absolutely can be upstream as we deal with these really difficult problems. How do we get people to switch to electric vehicles? That's in part you make it sexy, you make it desirable, but my goodness, there's a lot of friction you've got to remove from the process as well.
Yeah.
So we do need strategists who can go to clients and say, I've got a really interesting positioning for how you make this just the sexiest car on the road, but ain't going to work if people are still worried that they can't find a charging point. So I've got this other brilliant idea of, how you build whatever it is, an Airbnb for charging points. So that's the kind of thinking I think we're going to need in the future. And that's why I always come back to those kind of hybrid thinkers, more and more of those.
And do you think that there's a point about ecosystems? I mean, that really stretches, doesn't it, in terms of the kind of territory, I suppose, in which the industry normally plays? Because if you're talking about bringing in policymakers, customers in different ways, setting up an ecosystem which has lots of different players but works for the common good, you're going to need to really kind of broaden out the impact and footprint of, I guess, strategy in the industry. So again, it's a similar question. Is that possible to do you think? Is that, and what's the kind of change and shift, I suppose, in thinking that needs to happen if that's going to happen?
Yeah, I think, as always, it's about joining up some of the skills that we have currently in pockets. So
Right.
one of the things I was really sort of surprised by when during my time at Weber, kind of coming from an advertising agency, you sort of think you've seen it all, but there's incredible skill in those kinds of businesses around understanding policy and engaging policymakers, and understanding what it will take to drive a certain change through. So I think the networks that are best able to connect really diverse skills around problems are the ones who are going to thrive. And I think the problem we often face as an industry is we've got all the right people, we just don't even quite know we've got them, and we haven't connected them
Yeah.
in the right way. And something we talk about a lot is a kind of Dentsu on demand as a model, where if a brief lands in our ecosystem, we will connect the right people around it. Really doesn't matter where they sit in our business or beyond. We're going to find and connect the right group of people you need for that particular project, because the group of people you need to deliver the right answer today is so diverse that some of them may not be within the walls of your agency. They certainly might not be in a particular market or a particular silo of a big holding company, but the secret sauce is going to be how you connect them. I think Forrester talk a lot about that the superpowers going forward are going to be the talent management systems and the ability to connect talent. It's not just going to be about sheer scale anymore.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and we've talked a bit about that in other episodes of Fast as well, because it's such an interesting thought, isn't it, about how you bring diverse talent together in really sort of different ways, perhaps. And so you're saying there really that there's an opportunity for agencies to kind of really think smart about how they work with freelancers and consultants and other interested parties to actually augment the talent that sits within the agency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think modern creativity really is collaborative creativity, and you absolutely need those partnerships. You think about some of the things you'd want to solve for a client. If you had a healthcare client, you'd want people who understand pharma, you'd want people who understand HCP communications. But if you wanted to do something different, you'd also want mobile designers or people who understand wearables. You might want to understand people who understand mental health, and there's just such a diverse constellation of people you need. And yes, we need to get better at connecting the people we've got in the business, because they will sit in fundamentally different parts, but also reaching out to talent outside of it, and having just as we've got internal talent management, having sort of external talent scouts be part of our remit, I think is really interesting in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But unfortunately, we're running short on time, so I'm going to ask my last and final question, which is kind of my catch-all question, really, which is just about what the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what your answer might be to that. So, what would that be?
Well, I wish you'd asked me about my go-to quotations, because I was just thinking, what can I provide people that's useful? And basically, if you find some of these quotes in a presentation, there's a good chance I wrote it. So I thought I'd share some wisdom, generous sharing of wisdom from other people.
Right.
So what one I love is Clay Shirky. He talks a lot about behavior is motivation. No, hang on. What does he say? That's right. Behavior is motivation filtered by opportunity. And I use that all the time, because I think it's such a brilliantly pithy summation of everything we do as an industry. Inspire people, motivate them, and then make it really easy to make the change. That is brand and experience in a nutshell. So that's one of my go-tos. Something I'm using a lot at the moment is Yeats, that the center cannot hold, that very kind of bleak dystopian poem that he's got, The Second Coming. But I think there's a massive shift happening kind of culturally, commercially, around decentralization. I think people are stepping away from traditional centers of authority and ownership and control, and really kind of experimenting with really decentralized models. So Yeats, I think, was onto something kind of many years ago. I also like because I'm a sort of literature graduate. I like Tolstoy. He talks about all great literature is one of two stories: a man goes on a journey, or a stranger rides into town. And I love that, because to me it talks again about that coming together of brand and experience, because stories are journeys and journeys are stories. And if you're not thinking about how this journey tells a story, or how this story stretches across a journey, you're kind of missing out on half the job of a planner. So I use those a lot. And then there's a Healy quote that I like when I'm thinking about people and mentoring. He's got a lovely poem. It's called Station Island, where he's kind of haunted by kind of great literary figures of the past. And at the end, it just says, "Let go, let fly, forget. You've listened long enough. Now strike your note." And I think, for the young planners who kind of follow Firestarters, there's all this wisdom in the world. There are all the books, but you will find your own style. You'll mix and match from all the kind of classics, and come out with your own note and your own style at the end.
That's amazing. I think we had more wisdom there in the space of 2 minutes than you probably get from entire books. So thank you for that, Pat. It's really insightful. And unfortunately, that's brought us to the end of our time together. But thank you for being a part of Firestarters. Really enjoyed the chat. And so, Patricia McDonald, thank you very much. And great to have you on Firestarters again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neil. Great to see you. Take care.